And now we're going to talk about science fiction and fantasy. And here again, we're going to jump ahead a good bit because we've already covered the early years. We've already talked about Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, and we've talked about the fact that when Julius Schwartz, who had before his comic book career been a science fiction literary agent, brought a very science fiction bent to the DC universe, including the creation of this character, Adam Strange. And we're going to go a little bit forward to the 1970s. Of course, a lot of superhero stuff is very science fiction oriented, but we're not going to count that. Now, probably the most successful science fiction titles of the last half century have been those based on licensed properties, especially Star Wars. I mean, Star Wars has it would be difficult to list all the different incarnations of Star Wars and Star Trek. Battlestar Galactica didn't do as well when it first came out. Unfortunately, I kind of liked it. Anyway, looking beyond that, there were other things like a character that was created in the United Kingdom of Great Britain in the British comic book 2000 AD, who's actually supposed to be an American character, and who then showed up in a couple of different U.S. movies. Judge Dredd, kind of a dystopian figure who's in this future where judges are judges, juries, and executioners. In 1979, Marvel got a couple of licensed properties that were different from the stuff that had previously been released as licensed properties. Previously, it had been movies and TV shows, right? Like Star Trek and Star Wars, but before that, like Lost in Space or Space 1999. These comics were licensed properties that were toys. You know, the Micronauts were these tiny little action figures. Rom was kind of like a wind-up space robot. They didn't really have any backstory to them as toys, and so that was left up to the creators at Marvel. Both these comics lasted for several years and had other incarnations. In fact, one of the characters from Micronauts that wasn't one of the toys, an original character, Bug, wound up being a member of Guardians of the Galaxy later on. But both very well done. Micronauts is set in a microverse, a whole universe that is like in a tiny, tiny little area, and they make their way to Earth, and on Earth they're like 2 inches tall or something. Anyway, it's pretty good. Rom Space Knight is this character who's a cyborg who, like a lot of other space knights from his home planet Galador, had sacrificed half of their humanity to be made into cyborgs to fight the evil dire wraiths who were shape-shifting aliens who now have invaded secretly Earth and are taking it over. So Rom's got to come stop them. Both pretty good. Now, on the fantasy front, there was a French magazine that came out in 1974 called Metal Hurlant, heavy metal. There was an English version introduced in the U.S. in 1977. And whichever version you're looking at, the original French or the American, it's an anthology magazine. And it's a magazine, but it was all in color. Full of science fiction and fantasy stories. A lot of work in there by Mobius. In fact, it's his work in Metal Hurlant, and much of which was also reprinted, and some original stuff printed in heavy metal, that he is most famous for. In fact, here's just a sample of his fantasy style, and this is part of the reason that he is so highly regarded around the world as a comic book artist. Heavy metal was also made into an animated film in the early 80s. Now, Marvel, in the early 80s, came up, I think 1981, came up with their own version over in their magazine department, came up with their own version of heavy metal called Epic Illustrated that ran throughout the 1980s, about 10 years or so. And it was the same kind of thing. It had, it was an anthology book that had, in some cases, serialized stories that might have 5 or 10 parts, some standalone original stories by people from the comic book world, but also in some cases science fiction and fantasy writers. And it was on high quality paper, and because it was a magazine, it sometimes could have nudity and swear words and stuff like that, but tended not to have nearly as much of that sort of thing as heavy metal. Here's one example of a serialized story that appeared for a long time, actually, in Epic: Abraxas and the Earthman. I can't even begin to explain to you what it's about. It starts with whales, but it winds up with this guy out in space with invisible skin, and you would just have to read it. Over on the fantasy front, the sword and sorcery specifically, that's a subgenre of fantasy. In fact, Lord of the Rings, stuff like that, is called high fantasy. The implication being that stuff like this is not high fantasy. It's on the other end of the spectrum. But nonetheless, some of it can be quite good. Conan the Barbarian, of course, created in the pulp era by Robert E. Howard, brought to Marvel Comics in 1970, written by Roy Thomas, who adapted a lot of the Robert E. Howard stories. And then 1974, a second title was added, this one as a magazine, a black and white magazine, so there could be a lot more gore and nudity. The Savage Sword of Conan. Now, extremely popular throughout the 1970s and into the 80s. And then the movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger came out in 1981, made it even more popular. So we've talked about Conan before. We've also briefly met the woman warrior Red Sonja, who was an occasional comrade of Conan. And both of them have appeared a lot in Marvel, but also Dark Horse and various companies. The license has switched around back and forth. So those were the main sword and sorcery characters. But there were others. Some of them original, some of them like Fangor, based on other writers' fantasy. I think Fangor was based on something by L. Sprague de Camp. So you had Fangor of the Lost Land. You had Wolf the Barbarian from Atlas Comics, which, as we'll see later, is not the same thing as Atlas Comics. That's Marvel. It's the Atlas Comics owned by the guy that owned Marvel Comics after he got kicked out of Marvel Comics and formed his own comics called Atlas Comics. Anyway, you got Fangor, you got Wolf the Barbarian, you got Claw the Unconquered, and then you got more others. DC, you've also got The Stalker by Steve Ditko, co-creator of Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. You've got Beowulf, the Dragon Slayer. Over at Marvel, who were really on a Robert E. Howard kick, you had Kull the Destroyer, who's also a character that was created by Robert E. Howard. And then in the 80s, you had others. From DC, you had Arak, Son of Thunder, and Orion, Lord of Atlantis. So Arak, Son of Thunder, written by Roy Thomas, was and drawn by Ernie Colon. Arak, Son of Thunder. He was a Native American character from, I think it's supposed to be the 8th or 9th century, who gets lost at sea and floats way out there, and gets found by Vikings who bring him aboard their ship and adopt him. And so he winds up a Native American guy who is a mercenary in medieval Europe. It was actually pretty good. Orion, Lord of Atlantis, actually all three of these were pretty good. A sorcerer in ancient Atlantis before it sank. And over at Marvel, something that had gotten its start in the pages of Epic Illustrated, Murata the She-Wolf, kind of a woman warrior along the lines of Red Sonja, except instead of being in an imaginary land, she is British during the period when Britain was conquered and held by the Romans. So she is a Briton fighting against the Romans. But the best of the others, and by the others I mean non-Conan, the best sword and sorcery book outside of Conan came from DC, starting in 1975. It was called The Warlord. And it ran until the late 80s, maybe not the late, 86 or so, at least a 10-year run. And it was about this Vietnam veteran Air Force pilot who in 1975 is flying a secret mission over Siberia because he's spying on the Russians for the U.S. government. And he gets shot down and his plane crashes. And as he's stumbling around, like you tend to do, he found the entrance to a prehistoric world, Scartaris, which he walked into. And he, a 20th century American guy who happened to have brought with him his sidearm and a bunch of bullets and the know-how to make more, and that put him in a pretty good spot when he was sword and sorcering, because he had his sword and a .357 Magnum. But it was very well written and beautifully illustrated by Mike Grell. Now, you might be asking yourself, all well and good, but what about high fantasy? What is high fantasy? I think one way to look at it is it's got elves. I guess Conan could have elves, but they would be really wicked and trying to eat you, and he would stomp on them. In Marvel Premiere, there was a series called Weird World that was all about elves. It was epic fantasy along the lines of Tolkien. Started in 1977. In 1978, there was an independent comic put out by a married couple, Wendy and Richard Piney, called ElfQuest from Warp Graphics. And that lasted for, 20 years or more, and was extremely well received by its relatively small but very loyal fan base. The final genre we're going to look at is crime comics, which of course started in 1942 with Crime Does Not Pay, although you could argue that crime comics really started with Detective Comics #1, right? Because it was detectives, not superheroes, trying to catch criminals. But crime comics in the sense of focusing on kind of the sordid street level criminal activities, sometimes focusing in much more tightly on the people committing the crimes as opposed to the people trying to catch them. So, we've talked a lot about this already with the popularity of crime comics in the late 40s and early 50s, and how that played into the Senate subcommittee hearings. So, just like with horror, we're going to jump way ahead and look at ways that crime was dealt with during that Comics Code era outside of the confines of four-color comics. 1968, Gil Kane conceived an idea for a story, a crime story, that was a story of revenge that was going to be a self-contained but fairly long story. So he plotted this story out, and he drew it, got his friend Archie Goodwin to do the script work and do the writing for it, and basically published it himself as a black and white magazine. Now on the cover it says #1, as though there were going to be a #2. There was never any plan for a #2. It was a self-contained story. You might also notice, maybe you recognize the person on the cover. It looks just like the actor Lee Marvin, which led to some legal problems for Gil Kane. Anyway, he really wanted this guy to look like Lee Marvin. Now, something really significant about Savage is it is another step toward the modern graphic novel. It was a magazine. But the whole thing was one big long sequential art story that was self-contained. So one more step toward the graphic novel. Next, we'll take a look at Jack Kirby, who in the early 70s was lured away from Marvel again by DC Comics. They really wanted Jack Kirby, and they told him, "You come over to DC, and we'll not only pay you better, but you can do whatever you want to." And he wanted to do crime stories, which was kind of a problem because of the comics code. He also wanted to do a lot of science fiction stuff, the fourth world things we've referred to once before, and we'll talk about more later. But how to fix it so he can do those crime stories. This magazine was put out by Hampshire Distributors Limited, which was basically National Publications, the owner or the alternative name of DC Comics. So they kind of hid the fact that they were publishing it, unless you read the fine print, and released it as this black and white magazine with a really sensationalized cover. This is in 1971, In the Days of the Mob by Jack Kirby. Now, part of the reason for DC springing for this, in addition to the fact they wanted to keep Jack Kirby happy, was that the movie Bonnie and Clyde had been extremely popular in 1969, and then the novel The Godfather had also been extremely popular and was being filmed as a movie, so there was interest in this stuff. So this was released, and it was all crime stories, written and illustrated completely by Jack Kirby. Well, we get into the 1980s, kind of like the situation with horror. By the 1980s, because there's a direct sales market, comic companies are able to spread their wings a little bit, especially independent companies. And one of those was Eclipse Comics, that was pretty much exclusively dealing with direct market and comic shops. And we've mentioned them a bunch of times already, so maybe you figured out they were producing some of the best stuff out there in the early 80s. In 1981, they released this title. It was an ongoing series by Max Allan Collins, illustrated by Terry Beatty, about a woman detective, and it was called Ms. Tree. Get it, mystery. Anyway, ran for quite a while and was collected into graphic novels. 1991, Frank Miller started doing Sin City for Dark Horse Comics, and he did several collections of these very down and dirty crime stories that have been made into a couple of movies. The graphic novels themselves, the comics and the graphic novels that they were collected into, very, very heavily stylized. Frank Miller, we'll be talking more about him later for sure. His artistic style from the time he was doing superhero stuff in the late 70s was always very cinematic and lent itself well to that sort of thing. A couple of other graphic novels that have been kind of prominent have included 1997, A History of Violence by John Wagner and Vincent Locke, which was made into a movie with Viggo Mortensen. Also made into a movie, Max Allan Collins again, this time with Steve Lieber, On the Road to Perdition, which was shortened in the film to Road to Perdition. It's about a hitman for the mob back in the 1930s who's been marked for death himself, and he's on the run with his son, his young son, while he's being pursued by the mob. Made into a movie starring Tom Hanks in the title role. A couple of comics series in the 21st century, well, actually more than a couple that we're going to talk about, include 100 Bullets from Vertigo, DC's Vertigo imprint by written by Brian Azzarello, who is very much, even when he does superhero stuff, has kind of a hard-boiled vibe to his work. Ran for a decade. 100 Bullets, and then Marvel in 2006 started releasing Criminal by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips. Now Brubaker too, who has had a long run on Daredevil, like Azzarello, has kind of a hard-boiled noir vibe to his writing, even when he's doing superhero stuff, which here he is not. So both those series, 100 Bullets and Criminal, kind of revolve around a large cast of characters that at first don't seem to be interrelated. It's a bunch of different stories, but they all tie together. We've talked already about Scalped, which I pointed out is really, really bad when it comes to Native American representation. But as a crime novel, is really, really good, which makes me sad that I wish that they could have made it good without kind of using some of the methods that they did. Well, finally, I'm going to look at kind of a blended subgenre that I call superhero crime, which makes no sense because all superheroes, right, fight crime. Except we're talking here specifically about 21st century titles and heroes that have a crime novel kind of noir movie feel to them and are about heroes who may have even superpowers, but also kind of are more like real people who are down on the street level, involved in sordid goings on. And that includes The Punisher, as written by Garth Ennis in the early 2000s, and Alias, which introduced the character of Jessica Jones. We've mentioned her before when we were talking about women in comics. Kind of a hard-boiled noir, tough as nails detective, hard-drinking detective who's a woman. So this kind of blends the superhero and the crime genres together. All right, well, I could spend some time talking about the history of funny animals, but we kind of covered that. And sort of, if you're familiar with cartoons, animation, Donald Duck, Bugs Bunny, you know a lot about that already. So we're going to conclude our discussion of different genres, and we're now going to jump back into the narrative where we left off back around 1960.